We turn now to the Help album. Finally, he's going to talk about the music, you may be saying. Well, indeed we will. This album, recorded mostly in February and June of 1965, was released, as I said before, in August of 65. The UK version went to #1, and the US version also went to #1, but as we've said before, had far fewer songs here, like the Hard Day's Night soundtrack, because they could fit in other incidental music and scrape off even more tunes in the US to use for albums that were never released in that way in the UK. As I was saying in the previous video, the Beatles moved closer to the artist aesthetic, using a broader range of instruments on this album and more developed lyrics we'll talk about in just a second. There's a drive, as I said in the last video, toward more authenticity. You really are who you seem to be. A little bit more of sort of upfront, sort of talking about their own self and their own feelings. It's interesting on this album that Paul McCartney is playing some guitar. Paul had always been a guitar player in the group, and only went to bass because nobody else would do it. And so he's on some of the guitar leads here. Another Girl features a Paul guitar solo in it, and Ticket to Ride is also Paul on the guitar. George Harrison discovers the sitar at about this time, something that he discovered while they were filming the Help movie, and went into a kind of a junk shop or a bazaar or something, and sort of found a sitar and decided to take it home. Eventually ended up taking lessons with Ravi Shankar and becoming quite an accomplished sitar player. If you look at the cover of the album, it's got the Beatles doing what looks like semaphore, or spelling out letters or messages using flag and arm symbols. In fact, what that was originally supposed to be is LPUS. In other words, help us. But somehow, in production, the photo got flipped the opposite way, so it actually says SUPL, but the original intention was for them to be spelling out Help Us, because the name of the album, of course, was Help. So let's talk about the songs. Again, splitting it up into the John songs and the Paul songs, as we've done before, but now including the George songs and a couple of covers that are also included on the UK version of the Help album. The first John song to talk about is the title song, Help, which was also released as a single, as we talked about. We will, in the next video, do a musical close-up where we'll talk some more about Help. Interestingly, there we'll point out that this is another Beatles contrasting verse-chorus form, and more John talking about his misery and how unhappy he is, but we'll come back to that. In You've Got to Hide Your Love Away, another one that we'll talk about in the close-up coming up, we've got John Lennon very much under the influence of Bob Dylan, with Dylan-esque kinds of lyrics and maybe even a little bit sort of Dylan kind of vocal delivery. Now we have the use of the flute, or actually two overdubbed flutes, so we're starting to see more instruments besides the basic rock ensemble coming into the music. You're Going to Lose That Girl. This third John song on the album has got much more of a kind of Motown influence, at least if you read the Dowding and what's talked about in there. John talks about having been influenced by Motown, maybe Smokey Robinson, the Miracles, somebody like that. Ticket to Ride, which is another song that was released as a single. You want to note the guitar intro on Ticket to Ride, and we can sort of hook that up with some of the other guitar intro tunes that we've been talking about, going back to things like I Feel Fine, 8 Days a Week. Ticket to Ride fits in with that, as later will Day Tripper and Paperback Writer. The John song It's Only Love is another contrasting verse-chorus form. We're seeing more of these contrasting verse-chorus songs. So out of those songs that I've just mentioned that are on the album, there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 John songs here. And when you take the singles that were released earlier in B-sides, we find John using 3 AABA forms, but 4 contrasting verse-chorus songs. So you can see that there's a much more even and balanced distribution of AABA forms and verse-chorus types of approaches. Of the Paul songs, there's a great tune, AABA tune called The Night Before, which interestingly enough features John Lennon on piano this time. Another Girl, another Paul AABA form, as we mentioned before, featuring Paul McCartney on guitar. Tell Me What You See. If you look at the lyrics to that one, you can see them getting a bit more poetic. We'll come to that topic in just a minute when we discuss I've Just Seen a Face in the musical close-up. There's another Paul song with a Dylan influence. And again, when I talk about that one in just a minute, I'll want to focus on the seriousness of the lyrics there. And of course, Yesterday, which is also somewhat philosophical in AABA form, but now using classical strings as a way of sort of reaching out beyond the Beatles' ensemble of bass, two guitars, piano, maybe drums and vocals. So of the Paul songs, we've got 3 AABA songs, 2 that are contrasting verse chorus and 1 that's a simple verse kind of song. So again, we see, like we saw with John, a more balanced distribution of formal types and a kind of an inclination for the lyrics to get more serious and to bring in instruments outside of the usual thing. We've talked before about the guys using an audio snapshot kind of approach. Now we're starting to see a kind of a transition away from that. Even though when you're listening to the records, you would never get a sense that it wasn't the band performing in front of you. The fact is that different band members are performing on different instruments, sometimes on 2 different instruments at the same time, because the ability of being able to overdub instruments and things. And so what you're getting is the illusion of an audio snapshot, but already they're starting to, that idea of the audio snapshot is starting to break down. And by the time we get to Sgt. Pepper, will be almost entirely gone. Let's take a minute to talk about the George songs on this record. I Need You, an AABA form. We see George imitating what John and Paul have been doing up to this point. This one is it's a pretty good song from George. He's often complained that he had to write his first songs in public. Lennon and McCartney had years to write songs before any of theirs got recorded, but some of his first songs ended up being recorded. So when we see him, the first couple songs on these earlier albums, we're not really seeing him sort of as a sort of mature songwriter yet. They're still kind of songs that are on their way toward what he will be. But even this week, we'll talk about some songs that are, at least one song that's really sort of stands up next to the Lennon-McCartney stuff. You Like Me Too Much, another AABA song with kind of very average lyrics. Again, I think George Harrison would have admitted as much himself. But we are now beginning to see George Harrison songs finding a place onto these Beatles records. I Need You is interesting because George Harrison uses the volume pedal on the guitar, a pedal which controls the volume to give it that sort of violin swells, something he'd heard another group do on a record, and sort of contacted the guitar player and said, hey, what's that thing you're doing there? I kind of like that, and sort of worked that. So you're starting to see a little bit of experimentation with electronic kinds of effects with the volume pedal swell. It's a very little thing, but pretty soon volume pedal effects will turn into backward tape effects, and before you know it, there will be synthesizers on the albums. But anyways, this is a very early indication of that. Some cover versions that we might want to pay attention to. Ringo gets to sing Act Naturally, a song that had been originally recorded by Buck Owens, who Americans of about the same age of me may remember as being host on a show that was on during the 1970s called Hee Haw, a television show devoted to country music. Buck Owens and Roy Clark, I'm a pickin' and I'm a grinnin'. Well, anyway, Buck Owens, part of the Bakersfield sound in country music in the 1960s, had a hit with Act Naturally, a #1 hit in 1963, and Ringo, being a big fan of country music, wanted to do that song. They also did a song called Dizzy Miss Lizzie with John on lead vocal. This is a song that had originally been recorded by Larry Williams in 1958. The song was not a hit and came from the Beatles' Hamburg sort of cavern days. During these same sessions, they recorded another cover version that didn't make the album called Bad Boy, with John on lead again. Again, another Larry Williams song from this time from 1959 that was released in the U.S. only, at least initially, on Beatles 6. an album, one of those sort of made-up albums that never really were released in the UK. As we look over all of the songs together, before we go into the musical close-up to look at 4 of them very closely, as we look at them all kind of as a group, what do we see on Help? Well, we see the lyrics become increasingly serious-minded and philosophical. It's not so much now about teen relationships or teen love. It is now trying to get into more serious, or at least more mature, approaches to love relationships. We see the acoustic guitar being more prominent in Beatles music, and there's a bit of an audio illusion there, because even though now we're really used to the idea of somebody getting up with a band that's got drums and loud guitars and stuff and playing an acoustic guitar because the amplification is pretty easy. Back in those days, you really couldn't get an acoustic guitar amplified in quite the right way live, at least not the way it sounds on those records. So you're really getting a kind of a sound which appears to be an audio snapshot, but really is a sound very much mediated by the recording studio itself. Anyway, the acoustic guitar, I think, is a pretty good indication of the folk influences, in some case country influences, but I think in this case sort of the folk influence and the kind of Dylan thing and the saying something and the earnestness and the sincerity that's perceived to be associated with folk music. We still have plenty of AABA form in these songs, but it's balanced with more contrasting verse-chorus form. So I take that as an indication that when the Beatles don't write a song in AABA form, it's on purpose. And one of the purposes could be to kind of try to get away or break away from what they'd been doing so much of in the past, as they're sort of pushing the boundaries, looking for new ways to take their music. Again, we talk a little bit about the use of effects, and here I can kind of only really point to the volume pedal on the George Harrison song, I Need You, but we're going to get more of that coming very soon. And use of instruments outside of the rock ensemble. So even though they've used organ and piano in the past, here we've got the use of flutes, and we've got the use of chamber strings. So we're starting to see some of those features I talked about being indicative of a more artist approach, with a kind of lyrical approach that really lends itself more toward this image of authenticity that's forming as we go through 1965. So in the next video, let's do some song close-ups. Let's look at Help, You've Got to Hide Your Love Away, I've Just Seen a Face, and Yesterday.